Dr. Tate will actually be doing most of his own introduction, but I'll just give a brief introduction. He is an instructor in the Department of, let me see if I get this right, Departments of Radiology and Psychiatry, is that correct? At the Harvard Medical School. He graduated with a double major, I think, in psychology and anthropology from BYU, as well as a PhD from BYU in psychology. Is that correct? How long have you been there on as an instructor at Harvard?
5 years now.
Great. So about 5 years, and his lecture today, his presentation, is titled "The Therapeutic Nature of Cross-Cultural Relationships: Lessons from My International Field Study Experience." Welcome back to BYU.
Is this working? Sort of? Is it on? All right, good. I'm going to apologize right up front. I'm not a very good lecturer. I know you're not supposed to acknowledge these kinds of things before you get started, but I want the expectation to be where it really needs to be, and that's pretty low. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about something I feel pretty strongly about, and that's field studies. I really had a great experience in my undergraduate and graduate years here at BYU with two great opportunities to spend time in India. One, I got to go with my wife. That was cool. Two, I got to have a really unique experience that has taught me quite a bit. So I'm going to try and talk to you a little bit about that experience today and sort of what that means, if I can make things work here. So in way of organizing my thoughts a little bit, I give you this outline. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal background. That's by way of sort of making my biases known in some way or another. It's a good anthropological thing to do. That way you can determine whether or not you really want to listen to me. In fact, after you see some of my biases, you might want to, if you get up and leave, I won't be bothered. That's fine. You can leave any time during the lecture. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience on international field studies. And then we're going to talk a little bit about culture and how it's defined and how that's relevant to the things that I do as a neuropsychologist, and then talk about this idea of how having these experiences might be therapeutic in personal ways, both for the person participating in the field study and those who you are interacting with. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some unique cultures as defined by my current work. So first of all, by way of disclosure, I was born and raised in a place called Indianola, Mississippi. You might recognize it as the home of the Delta Blues, right in the heart of all of that. B.B. King actually is from my hometown, or I'm from B.B. King's hometown. Great blues player. Actually played guitar with B.B. King in the World's Fair in 1984. I sort of went like this, and he went like, this. And it was a very intimidating experience for me as a person in high school. We're converts to the church. My parents joined the church about the time I was born. So I have a lot of cultural, religious influences in my life, including grandparents and aunts and uncles who are not members of the church. And so just for you to know that we are converts to the church, and grew up in what is called the Mississippi Delta, where they raise catfish, rice, soybean, and cotton. Catfish and cotton are kind of the big things. So I spent a lot of time in cotton fields growing up as a kid. And this is one of those things that it's a personal story, and when I was growing up in the cotton fields, I spent a lot of oftentimes working the cotton, and I'd be over in the back of a cotton field by myself, I had all these really great ideas in my head, and I would talk to the cotton. There's nobody else to talk to, right? So the cotton never gives you feedback. So I'm a little concerned about presenting this lecture to you today about therapeutic nature of cross-cultural relationships because I haven't really talked to anyone about this. And I'm afraid that in this experience you guys are going to go, that guy's crazy. And personally, I would enjoy the feedback. If you could please give me feedback, because the cotton never gave me feedback. Feedback is a good thing. And so hopefully there will be lots of opportunity for that. Academic background, as was mentioned, both my undergraduate degrees and my graduate degrees are from Brigham Young University. Undergraduate double majored in psychology and sociocultural anthropology. My graduate degree is in clinical psychology with an emphasis in neuropsychology. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means here in a few minutes because neuropsychology is not a term that's always that familiar to people. So I'm married. I have 5 children and 1 on the way, which being on the East Coast, they go, oh my goodness, God bless you. That's the cultural norm there is to receive a blessing apparently just by the sheer fact that I have this many children. It's kind of a fun thing at the grocery store when they ask me if all of these are my children, and I go, well, I think there are a couple more at home. They really get worried, but anyway, it's fun. We have a good time. Our kids are great, primarily because of my wife's influence, not mine. And so they're growing like weeds and eating me out of house and home, but that's also a big part of my life. And I really want for my kids to have some of the same experiences that I did on field studies, just because of the unique experiences that I had and the things that it taught me. After my degree here at Brigham Young University, I went to Brown University to complete my internship and my postdoctoral fellowship, where I did more specialized training in neuropsychology. Neuropsychology is the study of brain-behavior relationships. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the brain and how it produces behavior and or the other direction, what the consequences of certain behaviors are on your brain, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Currently, I'm employed as a research associate at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. That's Peter Brent Brigham, not the Brigham that we're familiar with here. And also have an adjunct assistant professorship at Boston Medical Center, where I work with the Alzheimer's Disease Center there. Most of my work currently is in HIV. So I spend a lot of time working with HIV patients and understanding the effects of the virus on their brain and on their behavior. Now that patients are living much longer with the new medications, there are a lot of behavioral and or cognitive consequences that are a result of having the virus that we're just now beginning to recognize. So there are profound effects. I'm not going to talk a lot about that research, but would love to talk to anyone about that. So again, I'll show you one of the cool pictures that we have. This is actually MRI imaging, where we take MRI and we put people in the scanner and we take pictures of their brain. And this is a particular type of MRI imaging called diffusion tensor imaging that allows us to look at the white matter pathways or the tracks in the brain. So we can map out the connectivity within someone's brain using this technique. And it sounds really simple, but it's not really that simple. But it produces fabulous pictures. These pictures are fantastic. These are actually the fibers that connect to each hemisphere of the brain. So that's the corpus callosum, and these are the fibers that course through that. So that's kind of what I do currently. So I look at how these images, or what these images might be telling us about a person's behavior. or how they're doing cognitively, and how that relates to their clinical status as an HIV patient or an Alzheimer's disease patient or whatever the population is that we're studying. So I'm going to take you on my field study trip here, show you a little slide. So we went from Salt Lake to Bangkok, and in Bangkok we got off the plane and we spent the week there. My first experience of negotiating a price, I didn't do so well. She took all the money out of my hand. Then we went to Delhi, and there we did many things. These are just some of the pictures of us visiting different sites within Delhi and trying to be Sikh-like by wearing turbans. And then we went down to Bangalore and visited some of the sites there, some of the religious sites. Jaina, this is Srirunabelagoa, prominent Jain site, and this is one of the temples at Hilabid or Belur. I'm not sure which one this came from. And then we spent the rest of the time in Coimbatore. In Coimbatore we learned to ride the bus, which my wife apparently enjoyed. Not all the time did we enjoy that. But we taught English in the villages to the school children. I did work in the public and private schools working, and my wife studied women's issues within the village. So she carried water and washed clothes and carried wood and all those fun things, and then spent a lot of time at the chiropractor when we got home. And then we took an around the world trip and stopped in a few places on our way home. Now, what does that have to do with anything that I currently do? Well, I'll tell you, it has had some personal impact. First, it introduced me to the field of anthropology. I was a psychology major in the beginning. My wife met David Schuler, who's kind of I don't know, he's a legend, I guess, of sorts. A lot of people know David Schuler. He taught religion classes originally, and my wife took a religious course from him on New Testament and met him in that class. And he talked about going to India one of these semesters and doing work in an orphanage. And my wife came out, and I was waiting for her over here in the Joseph Smith building, sitting on the floor. And she came out, and she sat down right in front of me and said, "Guess what? We're going to India." And I had only been married for about a year. And I said, "Sure, we're going to India." Not realizing sort of what that meant overall for me in terms of my academic pursuits. That led to a second degree, a bachelor's degree in anthropology. In that, I was introduced to lots of important ideas that I hadn't been introduced to in psychology alone. One was that I learned the importance or value of qualitative research skills. And I think that's hugely important. It's one that's underestimated in the field of science. And I think it's one of those good opportunities to learn specific skills as you take anthropology development classes and you learn to interact and to question people about their culture and why they do the things they do. And so these research skills are very, very important. And they sort of provide a context for much of the other research, the more objective research that is done by other scientists. So it's a really important skill, and it does augment all of the other skills that you might acquire in other courses. It also provided an experiential foundation for my current employment. In fact, one of the reasons I was employed as a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University was because of my experience in India. In fact, I think I have a slide here in a little bit that shows that. But we spent some time, or have been spending some time in India here over the last several years doing research with HIV patients in Chennai, Madras. And it's been interesting to watch the different way in which the docs that I work with interact with the folks there in India, and the way that I choose to interact with the folks in India based on my experience. I really enjoyed my experience there in India and look forward to going back all the time. I think it's the food. It's the food. I love the food. So any chance I can get back to get authentic Indian food, I go. And I wasn't always like that. When I first got to India, I thought I was going to starve. I don't know if you know much about the cooking in Mississippi, but everything's fried. It's pretty, salt and pepper. That's it. So for 3 months, I didn't taste anything. It was so spicy and so hot. There was no flavor. And there was this time I had blisters in my mouth because they put that many peppers in anyway, there's all sorts of interesting experiences that you get to have, see? And that you remember for the rest of your life. And that's great. That's part of what it means to go on and do a field study or an internship out of the country. The other thing that I sort of stumbled upon as I was participating or doing this participant observation, that's the term in anthropology, right? And as you're doing that, there's some kind of cool things that can happen as you're learning about why people behave the way they behave. And sometimes behaviors that seem very odd and out of the ordinary for you are very ordinary and important symbols of interpersonal communication. So for one, in the United States, if I were to do this, I'm going to be brave and I'm going to just do this. If I went up to and I just sat here and he's getting very uncomfortable. Why are you uncomfortable?
That's awkward.
That's very awkward, right? In India, men friends, they hold hands. So the second time I went to India and I shook hands with some of the men there in the village, and they never let go. I had the very same. His hand was very sweaty, just so you guys know. I had the same reaction. It was like, oh no, what do I do? But in that moment, I'm exposed to a cultural bias that I have. And I think that's really important because in that it can become therapeutic, because then you can learn to go, well, should I be embarrassed? Should I be annoyed? Whatever the feeling is. In fact, no, I should have been, this is cool. I'm in the in group here. They're really accepting me as a friend, and they appreciate the fact that I've come back to India a second time. And I've taken the time to come and find them. That's what friends do. And so they were demonstrating to me this really nice thing, but it was very uncomfortable. Not only did he just hold it, he started swinging it back and forth, and we talked and we walked, and it was very weird, but very good friend. So it has very different meanings. So I think that's a really important pivot point in terms of this idea of therapeutic nature of cross-cultural relationships, because oftentimes you and I are not aware that we have cultural biases. We go around and we interact with people, and here at BYU we know how to behave, we know what to do, we don't have to be taught. We don't have to be shown. We know how to interact in our classes. We know it's not cool to answer a cell phone call, right, in the middle of class. Or is that the cool thing to do now? I don't know. Text or whatever. There are all these assumptions that you make, and you use those to interact with other people all the time. It's only when the assumptions don't match your own personal values and beliefs that we become aware, sometimes very acutely aware, that there's something going on there. This is really odd, and it shouldn't be happening this way. And then you become aware of those kinds of situations. And in that moment, it can be a learning experience. And so that's where this idea was sort of born in my mind that, hey, this could be therapeutic, especially if we approach these cross-cultural relationships with the idea that we could learn something from the people that we're interacting with. So I'm going to develop that idea hopefully a little bit more for you. It is kind of a half-cooked idea. I apologize. I made the mistake, too, of this morning sitting in my hotel and called my wife and kids to say good morning. Cultural thing to do, right? It's important, especially when you're married. Remember that, guys, especially. Call your wife. Let her know what you're doing, where you are. So I'm talking to my wife, and she's like, well, tell me how's the lecture's going. Well, I got this slide and this slide and this slide. And she goes, oh, I would do it this way, and it's that sounds, I don't get that. Next thing you know, I'm like 45 minutes on the phone with my wife redoing my slides. Not a good thing the day of the lecture. But it's another important illustration of this idea, therapeutic nature of cross-cultural relationships. I can't think of any better place to see this happen than in a married couple. You may be the same ethnicity, you may not. Even if you're the same ethnicity, you come from different backgrounds. And so when you put two people together 24 hours a day, and they come from different backgrounds, there's a lot of therapy going to go on. So there's lots of things. You're going to come face to face with a lot of things that managing. What do you do for holidays? What do you do for Christmas? Does your family do the same thing my family does? Our house. This was the big one in my relationship. The first few years, I thought we were going to wind up divorced because we fought over how to fold towels. She folds them in thirds, third again, and they look nice and neat on the thing. I just fold them in squares and put them up there. There's a difference, and it's really important. And people notice, especially your spouse. How to make the bed, that was another one. So the sheets have to be inside out, and so that when you pull the sheets back, you see the print, the nice print. Is that how you guys make the bed? I never paid attention to that. I just made the bed. Actually, I didn't make my bed. So it's in a marriage relationship, you have lots of opportunities to get some good therapy. Your spouse can teach you a lot of things about your personal assumptions and your behaviors just by interacting with them if you'll pay attention. If you don't pay attention, that's where problems will happen in your relationship. So I'm giving you some 17 years of marital advice. That's not a long time in some circles, but in the East Coast, it's a long time. I'm telling you. So let me develop this a little bit more broadly. So if we define culture, culture is kind of a complex thing. Some of you may recognize this 5-point. This is David Schuler's work, so I probably should quote down. He put a quote down here, but this was the slide he always gave us that had this 5 points. Culture is complex. It's characteristic of a group. It interprets experience and generates behavior. The one that we're going to focus on probably the most. It's transmitted from generation to generation, and it's not like we have to sit down and have lessons on culture. It's transmitted in a way that that's not very well understood at this point. And it's often in a state of slow but steady change. And so if we define culture that way, and we talk about how culture helps us interpret and our experience and generate behaviors, then so we can talk about it. We can use some psychological terms. Shaping is one of those behavioral terms, and that's typically how that we learn things. Culture shapes our behavior. So when you get in an elevator, these are all the typical examples that you guys know about. One person in an elevator, you know how to behave. Two people in an elevator, you know how to behave. You separate as far apart as possible, right? But you get a whole bunch of people in the elevator. If you want to have some fun, just don't turn around and be face to face with the person right in front of you. So when you get on the elevator, get on last and just walk right up in there and stare at everybody and see what happens. There's some culture shock that goes on for some people. And so it shapes our behavior. That's not right. You're not supposed to be doing that. And all of the looks and things that people give you in that instance are trying to shape your behavior. That guy's bad. He's staring at us. So they won't make eye contact, but all this communication that's going on is trying to shape your behavior. And so I think really important is that we're often unaware until we have experiences like that, or until you make those experiences happen like that. And I think this is critical. We go around and we behave, and our behavior goes on, and that's sort of what, in some ways, defines who we are. But we're not aware of why those kinds of things are happening. When you have these cross-cultural experiences, it can illuminate that behavior in a new light. You can go, oh, I didn't realize it. This is a more personal experience. I grew up in Mississippi. I went to a private high school. How to explain this? You guys are mostly Caucasian. I was the minority growing up in Mississippi, or Mississippi, as they say there. I was the minority. So we went to church. Our church wasn't segregated, but all the other churches were. So I had lots of experience with blacks, African American, and then I went on my mission. So I grew up and I played ball. We danced. We went to the stake dances together. We danced together. We did all these things. I didn't think I had any prejudice. And then I went on my mission to Jamaica, 98.97% black. And I had to come face to face with some of the assumptions that I had made all along. Things that Jamaicans do that are very different than the way the interactions are supposed to go in Mississippi. And so I had to face some of those on my mission. It was a good time to face it because it's just one of those opportunities to, in the gospel context, to sort of evaluate where your biases are coming from. But I tell you what, it was tough for me at times. I thought I was not prejudiced. But I found some behaviors in myself. I was like, holy smokes, I am prejudiced in some respects. And so I had picked those things up from my growing up, and my parents really worked hard to make sure that we were not prejudiced in any sort of way. But you just sort of pick some of those things up, and by osmosis, and you develop some of those tendencies. Anyway, it was a very eye-opening experience. A couple of times I remember serving with a black companion. And going in and looking in the mirror and going, oh yeah, I am a white guy. And being shocked to see this white guy, red guy, because I was a red guy. I won't tell you what they called me in Jamaica because it can be offensive here in the United States, but I was in the in-group because they used that term with me. I was in. So it was good. Even though every time they said it, I had to calm down this visceral response to what they were saying. It was just an interesting experience. So we can evaluate our behaviors in a new light, and that's where this awareness makes it possible to go, I like that part of me. I don't like that part of me. I don't like that part of me. I have to change. And so when we evaluate those assumptions, then we can accept or reject them and begin to make change. Now, that's my whole lecture right there in a nutshell. The rest of it is the stuff my wife, did you hear the way I said that? I have to be careful. The rest of the things are some of the ideas that my wife said, gave me ideas, and I started to throw them down because I think they're really important. Because culture is all around you. You don't recognize it sometimes, but it's there. It's around you all the time, and you're interacting with people, even in a homogeneous group like this side. This side's a little bit more heterogeneous, but this side's very Caucasian. Oh, Cholita, sorry. To the back row, mostly Caucasian. At least from where I'm standing, that's what it looks like. And I'm making some of you uncomfortable talking like this, right? But this is where culture comes into play. In Jamaica, it was amazing to me that some of the things that they talked about, I'm like, you can't. Can you say that? Can you talk about that? Okay. And it was really good. It was actually therapeutic in lots of ways to talk about some of those things and not to feel like anything that you were going to say was going to be taken in a negative way. So I forgot totally where I was going with this, and I have no idea. I'm looking at Dr. Bigler back there because I told him that I was going to ramble, and here I am rambling. Hopefully we're going to say something important here in a minute. Oh, you guys are all white, yeah. That's still not jogging anything for me. Oh, yeah, even within this homogeneous looking group, there's a lot of heterogeneous culture within it. And you guys can learn a lot from one another just by interacting if you'll take the time to do that. I think that's the point that I want to make most strongly today. However, as a neuropsychologist, one who's interested in the brain and behavior, I think, and it's interesting that my wife had to tell me that I should talk about some of these things because I am the neuropsychologist, right? I should know some of these things and be aware of them, but sometimes I'm not. And it's good to have that sounding board of my wife, who's not a neuropsychologist, talk about how she sees some of the work that I do. So it leads to these issues. There's a lot of effort, and Dr. Bigler and I were talking about this morning. There's a lot of effort in neuropsychology to try and understand the influence of ethnicity or race on some of the things, some of the measures that we make. Typically cognitive, behavioral types of measures. Behavior can be vastly different across groups of people. And they don't always sort of fit into, necessarily into the scope of the tools that we use to try and evaluate those behaviors. So some groups of people can come out looking very interesting on some of our cognitive testing. Interesting meaning either have significant weaknesses in certain areas. However, I think we need to, and I think that was the conclusion of our conversation, that we have to be extremely careful how we interpret some of these results because there are differences between groups of people, not because their brains are necessarily incapable of doing certain things, but that their cultural influences have trained them to be proficient in other ways. And so there's this idea of universals out there, which I'm going to talk about here a little bit more. It's really important for us to study these issues in neuropsychology because, one, the growing demographic reality of the world is that we're becoming more and more diverse. You're more likely to be exposed to foreign cultures, and BYU is really good because a lot of you served missions, a lot of you are exposed to other cultures through these kinds of programs. I think BYU, more than any other university in the country, sends students on international per student, right? More people on internships and study abroad programs than any other university in the country. I think I saw that. Is that right? Am I? No? Oh, I'm wrong. They're right up there at the top. Top. So that's really good. So you're getting a lot of exposure and opportunities to interact with different cultures. The other thing is that within neuropsychology, there's a lack of validated instruments to do accurate assessments. This is really problematic for the work that I do in HIV because HIV is not a disease of the United States only, but it's a disease that affects people throughout the world. And so if I take the test that I use here in the United States to assess patients in South Africa or in India or in Russia, we don't get the same answers. So there's some important work that needs to be done to develop these types of instruments that will help us be better at assessing and evaluating patients and helping them understand their prognosis and helping them progress in their treatments. I think another important part of this is that by studying these different groups of people, we have a good opportunity to begin to understand how the brain develops. There's some interesting things that go on, and I'm not qualified to speak to all of them, but development of the brain is really a fascinating topic, and there are lots of things that need to take place in your brain at the right times and at the right moments and under the right influences for things to work out pretty good. It's amazing how many things there are that could go wrong that don't go wrong. And I think that's a really important thing for you to remember as well, and that by studying these different cultures and assessing them, we will begin to understand better how the brain develops. And then, again, the sheer fact that we, in doing this, begin to appreciate the influence of culture on these types of measures. And that will increase our global awareness and improve our ability to negotiate relationships with people from all over the world. Now, there's some barriers. Culture's kind of complex. It's not this one thing, and to sort of make it in a way that you can study it or define it in a certain way that you can study it is sometimes difficult. So understanding where the influences are and being able to operationalize that piece of the culture that you want to study is not always an easy thing to do. Psychology has a history of misusing some of this information, and we have used it in ways in our history to say things about certain races and other cultures, and that has created sort of one of those visceral, negative, emotional type of things. When we talk about race and culture and we're trying to do the evaluation, people don't often want to talk about it because they're afraid of what the implications might be. Language is another huge issue. Even though I speak English, it's Mississippi English. Actually, it's Mississippi, Utah, New England English, which is, I don't know what that is anymore. But even though sometimes we speak English, and you'll find this out when you get married, even though the two of you speak the same language most of the time, sometimes there are some really interesting miscommunications that take place just because you're making assumptions based on the way that you learned language. Two, psychologists, neuropsychologists, oftentimes, because of that, will just translate wholeheartedly text into the other language. And if any of you have translated from one language to another, you know that's not a simple process, and that it's more complicated than that. And if you just do that, then you're surely not going to get the same answers, at least in my opinion. Also, the lack of interdisciplinary connection. So a lot of times we don't talk about these things. So this lecture is sort of coming from all different places, and it's motivated from the work that I do with MRI. It's motivated from the experiences I had as an anthropology student. It's motivated from my relationship with my wife. The interdisciplinary, we need to have this better discourse between disciplines so that we can understand. One thing would be really good is if psychologists who want to study these types of issues would not try to recreate the definitions of culture themselves in isolation, but that if they go to anthropology and go, those guys have been studying culture for a long time, they surely have something to say about culture and some of the things that might be important for us to study, then a good, unique interaction begins to take place. and you can benefit from that interaction. So again, there's another cross-cultural type of interaction, and it can be therapeutic and very important for the people that patient populations that you might be studying. In my case. And again, I'm going to keep emphasizing this because we're often unaware of these types of things. So I'll tell you a little bit about a study I did in India. This has nothing to do with that study. I'll talk to this in a minute. The universals is this idea that somehow the brain develops in similar ways, that there are certain aspects of my children. There are certain aspects of development that take place in similar ways regardless of where you are born and raised. I think that's very understudied. We don't do a good job of sort of examining that. I think if we begin to examine that, we'll find out that that's not always necessarily the truth of the matter. There probably there's certain parameters within which their development can take place. There are bounds, but in this middle here, there's all sorts of variability that can occur in that development. And so there could be some culturally unique patterns of development. The other thing is we're becoming acutely aware that the brain is very dynamic in its development and in its response to disease and in its response to even new learning. Now, I'm going to show you an example, hopefully. Let me change one setting really quick, sorry. So I'm going to loop through this. This is actually in a disease state. So it doesn't exactly apply, but I want to show you how dynamic the brain is. And actually we can measure this dynamic change. These are actually 3 different images of the same brain. They're using different MRI techniques to emphasize different tissue types. And so in this image, what you can see, actually, can we turn those lights down maybe? Because what's happening, this is in a patient who has multiple sclerosis, which is a disease of the immune system, and it causes inflammation in the brain and can lead to cognitive and motor deficits. But what you're seeing here is a movie of this same brain over the course of 1 year. Actually, every week for 8 weeks, every 2 weeks for 4 months, and then every month for whatever's left, 6 months. Yeah. So every month. So what I want you to do is to look at this spot right here. You can see it best right here. This is inflammation that's taking place in the brain. And I want you to look at the time scale. So if you look at it in 1 week time intervals, you can see that lesion expand and relapse and almost resolve completely in that 1 year's time. That's one of the characteristics of multiple sclerosis patients, is that they have this relapsing remitting course. And this is one of the reasons why we know this now. We understand why that's taking place, is because there's a lot of dynamic changes that are taking place in this person's brain. However, there are other imaging studies that show differences even in simple things like learning a new sport. I think tennis was the example I remember. But you can actually see some changes in the size and shape of the brain over a period of time. I think it was 6 months. I'm making this up. I'm just vaguely remembering the study. Dr. Bigler would give you the person and the date and the first author and the last author and all of that. I'm not to that point yet. So, but that there is a lot of dynamic changes that are taking place in the brain. So I want you to remember this. We used to teach that, you lose some brain tissue, you lost it forever. There's neurogenesis taking place, and there are reparative processes. Your brain doesn't take insult and injury just by throwing in the towel, it will respond and try to repair itself. Severe injuries and things like that, there's obvious limitations to the amount of recovery that can take place. But in learning new skills and about new cultures, I want you to think about this image that the brain is changing, and it's changing all the time. And so I have this thing here where behavior is the fundamental defining characteristic of a culture. That's how we typically describe a culture. We talk about how they do this and how they do that, when they do it, why they why is less talked about. When, what, where, and who are really important things that we talk about. But also, interestingly, in psychiatry and psychology, we often make diagnoses based on behavior, information. So we watch a patient, we observe them, we talk to them, and then we describe them in terms of their behaviors. And those certain behaviors fit into a category or a diagnosis. This is an interesting relationship because the brain's responsible for generating that behavior. It's also responsible for interpreting behavior. So there's this nice, and I tried to illustrate this by showing how these lines go between each of these and how they can influence. Culture influences brain interprets culture, and then generates behavior. Certain behaviors, if we engage in certain behaviors, we can change the brain, and that influences also how we then interpret our other experience. So it's this nice interplay between the two. And I'm going to skip that and talk about brain behavior and culture, and talk about these unique cultures that you might experience. Now, a lot of you are going to become familiar with people who have Alzheimer's disease. It's going to be it's a growing. The prevalence of Alzheimer's disease is growing within the United States. Some of you may even have relatives. Now, the behaviors of Alzheimer's patients are very different. And if you've ever had the opportunity to interact with someone with Alzheimer's disease, you'll notice right away that the behaviors are very different. And it makes some people very uncomfortable. And so, in some ways, you can think of these medical conditions producing a unique sort of cultural expression. And that if you took that to its extreme, that means that the brain is capable of generating a unique cultural kind of experience. And if you approach the situation in that way, I think it's a very different experience that you'll have with Alzheimer's patients than you would normally if you went, oh my goodness, that guy just talked about and he said that 3 times now, and he's introducing himself to me again. There's some unique opportunities that you can, ways that you can interact that would be both therapeutic for you and therapeutic for the patients. If you sort of approach it in that sort of respect. Mental retardation, mental handicaps, if you've ever been around someone with a mental handicap, their culture is very different than your culture, and it often violates your norms of proxemics. So they come up and get right in your personal space. They get really close. They want to touch and hold your hand. And that can be problematic for some people. It makes people scared because it's culture shock. That's what that is when that happens and you're going, they're touching me and I don't know what to say. If you approach it as, hey, this is another culture, I can learn something here, then it becomes a very different situation. You can learn those rules and apply them in those certain circumstances that you are doing. Suicide. Suicide's a whole other culture. When I was here as an undergraduate in the first couple of years of my graduate degree, I did a study with the Utah Department of Health where I went and interviewed all the families of kids who completed suicide in the state of Utah over a couple of year period of time. That was about 70 families. I had to go to the medical examiner's office and identify the suicides within that age group. And then I had to cold call the families as a representative of the Department of Health and say, "Hi, my name's David Tate. I'm from the Department of Health. I'd like to come and talk to you about your son or daughter's death. I understand they committed suicide or completed suicide, and we're trying to understand." Anyway, I had to do that cold call, and then I had to go and talk to these families. A very important thing that I learned from this whole circumstance is that in that instance of me asking them, we waited 3 months before we approached the families. It was a very interesting experience because it became very therapeutic for the families for us to come and talk to them. In our culture, especially here in Utah, where it's predominantly Mormon, suicide is a really sort of dramatic, drastic, not well thought of kind of thing. And these families were really hurting, and because of that culture, the opportunity to talk about it and to heal through that discourse with other people, they weren't actually getting the opportunity to do that. And so by the act of me just doing this because it was my job, you could see these families really appreciate it. So one of the things that I learned is that even though in these circumstances that the culture might be slightly different than yours, it's always okay to ask a question. That's the only way you're going to learn anything, is to ask a question in that circumstance. So these unique cultures that we deal with in psychology really can improve your abilities to interact with people of all cultures. And anyway, it can make you a better person, I think. Mark Twain on experiential learning, because that's kind of what we're talking about, is sort of getting out there and this participant observation idea of interacting with other people and doing that. This is what he says: "A man who carries a cat by the tail learns something that he can learn in no other way." So I'm going to end my lecture with that thought. Hopefully that will give you good entertainment and also speak to some of the things that I'm talking about that for a long time to come. You can get that image of someone holding a cat by the tail. Chicago Cubs. Did you guys see that? Stray cat, jumped onto the field. Security guard chasing him around. Couldn't grab the cat, finally got the cat by the tail. And he put the cat over the side of the wall by the tail, but he was learning what it was to carry a cat by the tail. So if you go type in carry cat by tail, that's what you'll see, I'm sure. Anyway, if there are any questions, I'll be glad to stick around. I know a lot of you have classes and things, so anyway, appreciate the opportunity.
You got your mics.
Any questions? Any doubts?
Good, I did a good job. Oh.
Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
I noticed that your master's was in clinical psychology, so I'm assuming you have some clinical experience in a therapeutic setting and not talk therapy kind of a way. So I'm curious, what are some of the practical implications of these lessons that you would use in a therapy room or dealing with people in that way?
I'll give you a good example. Mormon culture is very different. We actually had a therapist who came to the Utah Valley hospital who's not a member of the church, and he was doing some work with a woman. And the conversation went something like this. This is not verbatim, but she came in and she was complaining about the sunbeams who were talking all the time. And she began to, and this guy's ears perked up and was like, whoa, sunbeams are talking? Yeah, every time I go to church on Sunday, the sunbeams are talking, and they're getting up and running around in the room and all this kind of stuff. And it went on for about 20 minutes, this conversation like this guy really drilling her, trying to understand. And finally she went, wait a minute, you're not LDS, are you? And those of you who may not be LDS, sunbeams is the primary class. And so she was talking about sunbeams were children. And so there's those kind of questions. If you don't understand something, or even if you think you might understand, it might be better to ask a question in a therapy setting. That's not my line of work at this point in my career. I don't do therapy except with my children, but and that's not going very well. Anyway, you can use it in lots of respects like that. So if there's something that's sort of out of the ordinary, it's fodder for questions and trying to understand what's going on. And I think that's where that helps or would help me in that kind of circumstance or situation. So also, therapy is all about change. I think if you wanted to sum psychotherapy up, and people might be offended if I called it psychotherapy because that has certain connotation. But therapy, in the traditional sense of talk therapies and things like that, it's all about change. And the whole enterprise is taking what people are telling you, reinterpreting that so that they can see it better for what it really is, and then allowing them to make a choice as to whether or not they still want to engage in that kind of behavior. So that's sort of what this whole thing is talking about. That this is a good therapeutic sort of situation because we become aware of some of our assumptions and how our behavior is seen by others and how we see other people's behaviors, and then we can make change. So hopefully that was more clear than some of the slides. But anyway, welcome.
Well, I'm thinking about doing a field study the next spring, summer, and you talked about anthropology. I was wondering what maybe some ideas of yours would be on how to develop an unbiased project to sort of centralize some of the maybe problems or different cultural aspects in a different country.
Wow. We could talk a long time about that. There are actually classes. You guys are still doing the prep class, right, for field studies? So you have to take a class primarily specific to that culture. It would probably be better to know more specifically where you want to go, and then based on that and based on your experience in that class, take advantage of the personal expertise of the people teaching the class and things like that to ask them specific questions again about what might be good to study. It depends on what else you're interested in. I mean, for me, it was psychology. I talked to Dr. Bigler, who was my mentor here, and within 5 or 10 minutes, he had about 30 different ideas for me to do while I was in India. So, finding a good mentor like that would be very beneficial. That stuff has given me a lot of mileage too. The things that he suggested. So. I think that sort of learning to ask questions and not being afraid of asking those questions, I think, is sort of the important personal skill that you could try and develop. Go on dates, date lots and lots of different people and ask questions. There you go. That's a fun one.
Just one more question.
Or it used to be.
I'm not sure if you're allowed to, how much you can tell us about the study you did, about the suicide story-related, the study you did in Utah. But I'm curious to know, in our Mormon culture, was there a common denominator for the families, the kids who committed suicide, etc.?
The short answer to that is no. Suicide's very much more complicated than I think we often sort of attribute to the behavior. There are all sorts of things that are going on, from a biological aspect to a cultural to a personal, interpersonal type of circumstance. So it's really multifaceted, and often it's the common denominator to me was it's often the person that you sort of didn't expect would do that. And these were people who had, academic achievements. They were good. They were relatively good students for the most part, and they just saw the world in a slightly different way, which is again not a bad thing. It's a different thing, and sometimes our culture sort of interprets those behaviors differently. So I don't know. I could talk myself into trouble by sort of rambling on here about that because it's really complicated, more complicated than I ever expected. Because I went into that study with certain biases of my own. I actually had a couple of friends in high school who did complete suicide as well. And I was like, man, those guys are stupid. I can't believe they did that. And I was more angry at them. And so I reacted in a different way. So when I went into this study, I had certain biases that I had to face. And it became acutely obvious, that this was way more complicated than I had ever thought. One reason, because I didn't go to those families of my friends. I say, tell me what happened, why? And I didn't go ask those questions, but as I was asking those questions, it became really obvious that it's very complicated, and I'm going to say this as brothers and sisters, don't judge people who commit suicide